So I want to thank the Brooks Institute and the University of Toronto and Angela and Justin and Amy and everybody for this invitation. I'm really excited to be here today. If you see that I lower my voice after a while because that's my natural tone, remind me and I will raise my voice. So before I talk about my book specifically, I would like to set the context of this presentation since I was kindly invited to talk today about the animal question. There is a precedent when it comes to being invited to talk about the animal question at conferences. In 1997, South African novelist J.M. Coetzee was invited to deliver a lecture on human values as part of the Princeton Tanner lecture series. Coetzee is mostly known for his novels about South Africa, but that day he talked about animal rights. It would not be easy to get credibility on a topic that was not directly related to his work since he's just a fiction writer. So what Coetzee did is that he found a way to talk about animal rights without getting credit for it, or rather without getting in trouble for it. Since he's a fiction writer, he wrote a story about a protagonist named Elizabeth Costello, who was herself invited to give a talk on her novels, but chose instead to talk about animal rights. In other words, Coetzee hid behind fiction. He said what he had to say, but through a fictional character. And he made sure to let us know that the audience in his story was not really happy about the speaker because she had no credibility and no authority on the topic of animal rights. And indeed, what right did she have to talk about this? Which is a question also that applies to Coetzee. What right did he have to come to this Princeton conference to talk about animal rights? But the real question is, who does? What does it mean to talk on behalf of animals who cannot speak for themselves? And more to it, what does that mean to talk on behalf of someone who cannot represent themselves, human or non-human? It's a question particularly relevant for lawyers and future lawyers at an animal law conference. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an animal. I'm very aware of being an inadequate speaker myself. But I find, like Coetzee, addressing this inadequacy and not shying away from it is an important part of talking about animals, and more broadly, talking on behalf of anyone who cannot represent themselves. In 1997, so the same year as the conference for Coetzee, another person, French philosopher Jacques Derrida, was invited also at a conference in France to talk about the animal. And he chose a different approach from Coetzee. He decided not to hide behind a fictional character, but instead to show his vulnerability. Derrida talked about feeling naked as he takes a shower in front of his cat, explaining his nakedness to an audience who was staring at him, just like his cat did. I'm not comparing myself to Coetzee and Derrida, even though I'm in the same situation. I feel a bit naked and vulnerable in front of you today. But I wanted to bring them up because I was invited to talk about the animal today, and I find myself in need, like them, to figure out how to address the animal question at a conference. So I'll start with the word capture and a picture. I don't know if you remember this picture from 2019. This is an American banking executive from Texas who paid $110,000, the highest amount by then, for a permit to kill a rare mountain goat in Pakistan. We can see a lot in this picture. Trophy hunting, man winning over beast. We could even talk about Western, imperialistic, and hyper-masculine fantasies. But the thing that really gets me in this picture is how uncanny the whole thing is. The blurring between dead and alive, the frontier between the two. I remember Freud using the image of the doll to talk about the uncanny, this blurring of frontier between the dead and the alive. Because the doll looks alive, yet it is inanimate and dead. It can be quite eerie to stare at a doll. And this Pakistani mountain goat is uncanny, like a goat. Like a doll, sorry. The animal is positioned in such a way that he seems to be looking at us in a casual manner, and we are made to look back at him. But in fact, the situation here is very different from Derrida's famous cat. In his talk, Derrida talks about his pussycat who had been looking at him naked in his bathroom all along, and when he returned the cat's gaze, Derrida felt self-conscious. But more importantly, Derrida was able then to measure the true and individual existence of his cat. Derrida felt the gaze of the animal like never before. But with us, with this mountain goat, it is different. For a second, we feel the gaze of this animal on us, but we soon realize that the captured animal is not looking at the lens and not looking at us through that lens. He's dead. In the end, the trophy hunter didn't really capture the animal. As Susan Sontag said once about photos, photographs really are experience captured, and the camera is the ideal arm of consciousness in its acquisitive mode. The photograph is indeed the experience captured, but when you think of it deep down, it doesn't capture much. For example, if I go to the Grand Canyon tomorrow and I feel like the landscape is bigger than life, so I take a picture to try to capture that landscape. But in fact, I'm hiding behind the lens because I don't know how to capture something that is life or bigger than life. This is why tourists take pictures all the time, because they don't know how to capture the moment. When I look at the picture of the trophy hunter with the goat, I can see the Texas man trying to capture what brought him to Pakistan. With the photo, he tries to capture the wildness of it all and the animal in its natural habitat, which is so different from Texas. But in the end, this is not what he captured. What we see is a lifeless shadow of a wild animal, a soulless corpse imitating life. Look at the comment that this hunter made to a Pakistani journal. He said, "It was an easy and close shot, and I'm pleased to take this trophy." This comment attests to the impossibility of capturing the wild animal. It was an easy and close shot because the animal was already no longer this inaccessible, rare, and wild existence to be captured. The beast is dead, like just the picture is frozen in time. This is what captivated me with Angela Fernandez's recent book, Pearson versus Post, The Hunt for the Fox. The Supreme Court case of two wealthy men fighting over a dead fox because one was in mere or hot pursuit of the wild animal, while the other hijacked his hunt and killed the fox. When we follow the whole legal ordeal all the way to the Supreme Court, it's clear from Fernandez's book that the case is not about the dead fox, but it's about men, their presumptions and ambitions. It is so easy through words, discourses, and goals of persuasion to forget about the animal. Writing a book about the animal question meant for me being mindful of this, not forgetting the animal in my goal of persuasion. This is how I wanted to start this presentation. I wanted to show that it is not easy to capture the animal question, just like it is not easy to capture the beast. And it is even less easy to capture the animal question in an intersectional context, when one tries to put the animal in conversation with Blackness. It took me years to try to conceive this book properly, trying to be as considerate for animals as their human counterparts. But my book is also a redress when it comes to animal rights activism and a specific discourse about the animal where too often Blackness is used to advance the animal cause at the expense of the Black cause. Oops, I forgot. This is from the book. You can see Pearson, Post, who was doing the hot pursuit, and Pearson just standing there and waiting for the fox, and Renard, the fox. My book is about Blackness and the animal, and how the two questions are assembled and disassembled. The most challenging part about writing this book was the need to grapple with the question of analogy in an intersectional context. As we'll see, there is no doubt that race and animality are historically intertwined. And we should not ignore this historical interconnectedness. But at the same time, we should be careful not to further promote the black animal comparison at the expense of one or the other, by purposely always putting them side by side. Afro-Dog looks at the relation between blackness and the animal question in the Americas and the Black Atlantic from the Middle Passage to the Black Lives Matter era. It is a wide-ranging historical scope, as you can see, with modern relevance. I was writing this book in the midst of the 2015 Ferguson riots and the 2016 Standing Rock demonstration, two events where the respective use of police dogs against rioters reminded me of previous instances in American history where dogs had been used against Blacks and Native Americans. It is important to understand that canine weaponry against racialized subjects is a long-standing tradition in the Americas. In the 16th century, Bartolomé de las Casas documented in horrendous detail how Spanish conquistadors trained their dogs to chase and devour Native Americans in the West Indies. During the slavery era, slave owners were also known to launch their bloodhounds against runaway slaves in the Caribbean and the American South. Fast forward to the 1960s, and you see a similar use of police dogs against civil rights rioters in Birmingham and protesters in Birmingham and Selma. This picture comes from one of those infamous moments in American history where police dogs were used against Blacks only because of their claim to freedom was seen as something to be contained through canine weaponry. So when in 2015, the report by the Department of Justice on the police department in Ferguson uncovered excessive use of canine force on Blacks by the police, my manuscript took on a whole new sense of urgency. As the Department of Justice report revealed, and I'll just read the two underlined quotes here, in every canine bite incident for which racial information is available, the subject was African American. And it shows that race may play an impermissible role in officers' decisions to deploy canines. So racialization often goes through a hardly disguised process of animalization. Think, for example, of Barack Obama, who was compared to Curious George the monkey during the 2008 presidential election. Or DeSantis, that saying that electing his opponent, Gillum, for government would monkey things up in Florida, which some took as a dog whistle strategy to racialize the campaign. And it is not limited to America. In France, for example, a far-right Front National politician in 2013 compared then French Minister of Justice, Christiane Taubira, to a monkey, going as far as you can see, putting the two pictures side by side. And it says, the monkey says at 18 months, and Christiane Taubira says now. So no wonder that the 2018 HMN Coolest Monkey in the Jungle ad was seen as racially insensitive in an era where Blacks and monkeys are still being put side by side in our collective consciousness. I see a clear correlation between canine weaponry and forms of expression that bring race and animality together. Sometimes the analogy is intentionally racist. Other times it's more complicated. Which brings me to the question of animal rights activism and critical animal studies. My book brings attention to the interconnectedness of all forms of oppression and seeks to make activists and scholars more aware of the danger of advocating for one cause at the expense of another. I'll take a telling example from a couple years ago. I don't know if you know Brigitte Bardot from back in the days. So Brigitte Bardot was known in the 50s and 60s as a French sex symbol. She's also today one of the most well-known animal rights activists in France. She's also a sympathizer of the far-right French political party called the Front National. The former actress has been repeatedly fined by the French government for using hate speech, particularly against the French Arab and Muslim population because of their halal ritual practice. In 2019, Bardot was at it again, and this time against the population of the island of the Réunion. She called them, I quote, degenerates, savages with cannibalistic remnants, because of their Hindu religious tradition of sacrificing goats. Bardot was fined 20,000 euros by the French court for inciting racial hatred, even though her lawyer tried to argue that it was her passion for the animal cause that was an excuse for those words. The island of the Réunion is a former French colony off the African coast. Bardot does not see that her French so-called civilized superiority is a colonial vestige that takes part in a logic that applies not only to humans, but also to non-humans. Supremacy is not only white and Western, it's also human. Fighting against animal exploitation cannot hold the course without all sorts of allyships, including an anti-colonial and anti-racist approach to all matters of power, domination, and oppression. Bardot famously argued once that as a former sex symbol, she knows how it feels to be haunted. And we see here that she's aware of the interconnectedness of systems of oppression and how sexism connects with speciesism, as she was personally impacted by it. But the problem here is that her approach is still nearsighted and not expansive enough. Another example is the Michael Vick case. Jim Goent, author of the New York Times bestseller, The Lost Dogs, covered the rehabilitation of Michael Vick's pit bulls after the NFL quarterback was convicted for his illegal dog fighting ring. In his book, Goent criminalizes Vick through a not so subtle animalization of a black man. This is how the author describes Vick as shown on screen here. Vick was now 20 and fully grown, 200 pounds and slightly less than 6 feet tall. He was thick yet compact. His large brown eyes and small white nose were offset by a strong jaw that made it look as if he had an underbite. Topped off with a goatee, the total effect of these traits was to give Vick an appearance that, while handsome, could be fairly described as almost canine. This conjoined racialization and animalization is not new, but it is particularly striking when it is used in an animal rescue context, blatantly desensitized to other forms of oppression. What we call today the animal turn is often presented as a follow-up to the post-colonial turn that started in the 1990s. Scholars have shifted their interest from one type of otherness to another across species, but they have maintained a connection between those two successive interests with the question of blackness. The idea of comparing the black with the fate of the animal started in an abolitionist context, with 18th century English philosopher Jeremy Bentham, one of the forefathers of the animal rights movement. Bentham published an introduction to the principles of morals and legislation in 1789, the year of the French Revolution. Bentham was inspired by the French values of universalism. In the book, the philosopher makes a plea for universal compassion for all sentient beings, a plea that led him to compare the fate of blacks with that of animals in the eyes of the law. The day has come, I grieve to say in many places it is not yet past, in which the greater part of the species, under the denomination of slaves, have been treated by the law exactly upon the same footing as, in England, for example, the inferior races of animals are still. The day may come when the rest of the animal creation may acquire those rights, which never could have been withholden from them, but by the end of tyranny. The French, and you'll see afterwards why I emphasize that sentence, the French have already discovered that the blackness of the skin is no reason why a human being should be abandoned without redress to the caprice of a tormentor. It may come one day to be recognized that the number of the legs, the velocity of the skin, or the termination of the os sacrum are reasons equally insufficient for abandoning a sensitive being to the same fate. Bentham took a drastic move away from the Cartesian thought. For René Descartes, the French philosopher, because animals do not speak and cannot reason, they have no soul. But for Bentham, what matters is not who can think, but who can feel And he concludes the famous passage with what has become now his trademark. The question is not, can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Bentham has paved the way for animal rights activists and animal studies scholars, offering them an angle to address the animal question through the lens of blackness. Marjorie Spiegel, in her 1988 book entitled The Dreaded Comparison, takes Bentham's analogy to a whole new level by making black slavery the main subject of her argumentation. The dreaded comparison that she mentions in her book refers to the comparison between the treatment of black slaves then and the treatments of animals now. And the book is illustrated, and I'll just show you two illustrations from the book where you can see side by side animal and slave. And same here, the picture, the second picture that you see, industrial farming, and the other picture is a slave ship. Animal studies scholars and animal rights advocates have relied on Bentham and the legacy of the abolitionist movement to contextualize their discourse. Their goal is to show the importance of intersectionality in any system of oppression, regardless of the victim's human or non-human nature. PETA has also capitalized on this dreaded comparison in their controversial Are Animals the New Slaves exhibit. To make it even, besides you can see here, it's not slavery, it's Jim Crow, segregation era, but it's the same side by side. PETA has also capitalized on this dreaded comparison here, and to make it even more explicit, Professor of Law Gary Francione spearheaded a movement in animal rights advocacy that now we refer to abolitionism or abolitionist veganism. The cover of this picture from a 2015 book leaves no doubt as to the black slavery comparison in a vegan abolitionist approach. Francione takes after British politician William Wilberforce, who was one of the leaders of the abolitionist movement to end the slave trade, but also one of the founders of the world's first Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, SPCA, in 1824. So in other words, the connection between black slavery and animal rights activism cannot be ignored. It's a historical fact. The connection is truly here. But now the problem is more how this connection is treated, and even more so, how it is used in a literal sense of opportunism. In a dreaded comparison, Spiegel justifies her cross-species approach by saying, and I quote her, "Comparing the suffering of animals to that of blacks or any other oppressed group is offensive only to the speciesist, one who has embraced the false notions of what animals are like." Spiegel pursues her speciesist comment by saying, "To deny our similarities to animals is to deny and undermine our power." But the possessive pronoun here, our power here, no longer refers to blacks, but to the human species. But what we've seen, her book does not deal about the comparison between animals and the human species, but between animals and blacks, particularly at a time when blacks were legally deemed less than human. It is obvious that the so-called dreaded nature of the comparison is not its interspecies quality, but rather its racial together with animal component, which is reminiscent of the racist discourse that precisely supported the slave trade. So Spiegel avoids a real and direct confrontation with what she herself ironically calls the dreaded analogy. And this is where we reach the real problem with the comparison between the enslaved black and the animal. The comparison is problematic when its sole function is to serve the animal by instrumentalizing the black cause. One cannot advocate for one type of victims while dismissing or even oppressing another in the same process. As author Claire Jim Kim puts it so pertinently in her book, Dangerous Crossings, each engages the enemy from a separate bunker. We need to learn this bunker mentality and think more connectively. By the same token, it is important to be aware of our idiosyncrasies and of what makes each battle unique. Intersectionality, for example, is a term first coined by a professor of civil rights and institutional law named Kimberly Crenshaw. She used the word in 1989 to refer to the multiplied discrimination of Black women on the basis of both race and gender. This term is now of common use in animal rights discourse. In theory, this form of appropriation is useful to show the paradigmatic nature of oppression. In practice, however, the appropriation tends to erase the very reason why Crenshaw needed to create this neologism, this new word, in the first place, which was the invisibility of gendered Blackness. What needs to be thought differently, therefore, is again, how to create alliances and solidarity without dismissing one cause for the benefit of the other. What we see in the comparison is that Blackness is often dismissed in the equation. Chi Gossett, a scholar working on race and animal studies, said that, and I quote him, "For many in animal liberation and animal studies, abolition is imagined as teleological. First, slavery was abolished, and now forms of animal captivity must be too. It is as though animal is the new black, even though Blackness has always already been racialized through animalization." And like Gossett, I think that looking at the analogy in a sequential manner, first the black and now the animal raises some issues. One of the issues is that it offers a wrong perception of what Betham meant. For example, philosopher Peter Singer, who is the forefather of the modern animal rights activism, published his very influential book, Animal Liberation, in 1975. In it, he uses the famous quote from Betham, but he says that Betham wrote that passage at a time when, and I quote him, "Black slaves had been freed from the French, but in the British dominions were still being treated in the way we now treat animals." But the thing is, when Betham published his book in 1789, slavery was not abolished in the French colonies. Betham's comment mostly likely did not imply that Black slaves had been freed, as Singer suggests, but rather that the French, and particularly what we call in French la Société des Amis des Noirs, Society of Friends of the Blacks, had been able to see past skin color in their pursuit of human rights. For Singer to imply completion is symptomatic of the modern way that animal liberation looks at the intersectionality of Blackness and the animal question. Oftentimes, we see a conditional logic, like if freedom was once granted to Blacks, it should not be granted to animals. But just as much as Betham did not mean to say that freedom was granted to Blacks then, the same is true today. For example, as Michelle Alexander shows in her book, The New Jim Crow, the mass incarceration of Blacks and their subsequent disenfranchisement as ex-convicts draws an important connection between Blackness and depersonhood today in America. Oftentimes, even after serving times, Blacks are not free. And this is where I see a form of opportunism in the animal question. Blackness cannot be used to justify the animal cause while at the same time being dismissed as something of the past. By presenting the animal as the new black, the racial question is de facto passé, which seems to somehow reflect our so-called post-racial era. The Obama era started with the fallacy of race no longer being an issue, a color blindness that ended up, inversely, exacerbating our racial consciousness, which explains now that we entered the Black Lives Matter era. Ironically enough, as the fantasy of global color blindness has increased, so has racial consciousness. And this exponential phenomenon can be explained by comparing it with the example of France, where color blindness has been an intrinsic value of French republicanism since the 1940s. The French Constitution sees its people as we say, one and indivisible, regardless of racial, religious, or cultural backgrounds. France's ideal of indivisibility, along with its anti-communitarianism, has made it unrepublican to formally collect data on racial differences and quotas. Though a noble cause, in theory, racial invisibility in the French Republic has, in practice, created a situation in which racial discrimination cannot be addressed, since race does not officially exist in France. In fact, in 2018, the French Assembly unanimously voted to delete the word race from the French Constitution. Institutionalized colorblindness results in making not just race, but also racial discrimination a non-problem. As Achimbembe puts it, the perverse effect of this indifference to difference is thus a relative indifference to discrimination. Racial irrelevance seeks to highlight the progress made on behalf of the victim, so much so that the subject no longer needs to be perceived as a victim. But the flip side of it is that racial irrelevance ushers activists onto the next battle, leaving the preceding one behind instead of looking at both together as an ongoing cause. A good example of it is French journalist Émeric Caron's book released in 2016 entitled Antispéciste. The book was a bestseller in France. It introduces within the French context a field dominated by Anglophone philosophers. Caron explains his role as an animal activist using the example of the Amistad case. You may remember the story. In 1839, slaves from Sierra Leone aboard the Amistad slave ship managed to free themselves and killed most of the crew in an attempt to sail back to Africa. But they were recaptured off the American coast and tried in an American court of law to define if they belonged to themselves or to the crew. Abolitionists assisted in their defense, and former slaves who spoke Mende, the language of Sierra Leone, helped out with a translation, since the defendants couldn't speak English. And as I said at the beginning, this is the perfect example of speaking on behalf of the one who cannot represent themselves. Translation and legal representation are very much connected in this case. Caron compares the role of those translators with animal activists, and he says, anti-speciesists are the translators of the Amistad. So far, it makes sense. But the problem with Caron is that his race/animal comparison doesn't follow through the book, the course. For example, when he mentions the 2015 infamous case where an animal dentist and modern-day safaris killed a protected lion called Cecile in Zimbabwe, Caron never mentions the intersection between race and animal exploitation in that case. By not mentioning the geo-historical importance of Africa in the case, Caron somehow dismisses the fact that the Black continent in which Cecile the lion was killed as the birthplace of an epistemology of power and domination matters in the slaughter of Cecile the lion. Caron's handling of Cecile the lion exemplifies how an anti-speciesist discourse can supersede racial concerns when, even though the connection is what should be addressed. In the time remaining, I would like to give an example of how the law sometimes works in ways that forces us to look at the racial and animal question together. Because again, I want to emphasize that it's important to look at both together. It's just how you do it. As I mentioned earlier, it is important to keep in mind that bloodhounds were imported to the Americas to chase runaway slaves. In this case, one species started taking after another, taking after in the sense of running after the other, but also starting to resemble each other. In his fictional book, Le vieil homme esclave et le molosse, the Martinican novelist Patrick Chamoiseau gives a poetic rendition of the chase, showing clearly how one takes after the other. And as we see, the dog was used as a mean dog, whose role was to run after the bad slave. The dog and the slave were both perceived as bad in this unrestrained chase, and this transpired in the law as well. In her book, The Law is a White Dog, Colleen Diane explains that for centuries, American and British law has been struggling to determine the status of the dog because the dog is said to be a hybrid kind, trainable but still potentially vicious. We've all heard of dogs snapping and turning against their owners. Dogs are in that sense different from a cattle animal that is fully submissive. The dog's imperfect trainability is what makes this animal not fully ownable in the eyes of the law. On the other hand, in slave codes, the slave was said to be fully ownable. Of course, disavowing the imperfect property status of the slave was the only way to make slavery-based economy sustainable. But even though it made the slave-based economy sustainable, it didn't make everyday life sustainable for slave owners. in the back of their mind, there was always the fear of slave retaliation, because those slave owners knew that, in spite of what the law says, slaves cannot be fully owned. This is why you had slaves poisoning and attacking their masters and starting full-on wars. In Jamaica in the 1700s, for example, there was a slave rebellion leader named Cudjoe, whose attacks against the British were known to be dreadful and very bloody. Cudjoe was every slave's worst nightmare. Now, the name Cudjoe may sound familiar to you because there was also a vicious dog named Cujo in a horror movie based on a novel by Stephen King, Cujo. Cujo, this horror movie from the 80s, is a story of Saint Bernard named Cujo who contracted rabies. The dog turns against everybody in a bloodbath and eats his owner alive. Is it a coincidence that this rabid dog was named like the dreadful slave rebel? I don't know. But in both cases, you have a similar collective consciousness based on the fear of chattel retaliation. The problem with chattel and movable property is that it always has some sense of agency. Whatever the law says, chattel slaves and dogs are both imperfect properties. Colleen Dyant's tour de force in her book, The Law is a White Dog, is to have put side by side two legal cases that bring out a striking resonance between dog and black law. Both laws are related to the question of restricted freedom of movement in America. The well-known racial case, Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896, and the dog case, Santos versus New Orleans and Carlton Railroad Company of 1897. They both reached the Supreme Court 1 year apart. And in both instances, Justice Brown was left with the task of determining what kind of restrictions of movement should be imposed on the black and the dog. In Santos versus New Orleans, Santos was seeking compensation for the loss of property after an electric car negligently killed his dog. When the case reached the Supreme Court, Justice Brown ruled against Santos, stating that in Louisiana, there is only conditional property in dogs, meaning that the dog must be registered and wear a collar in order to be legally considered personal property. And Santos' dog was not registered. But more importantly, Justice Brown said, property in dogs is of an imperfect and qualified nature, and that they stand, as it were, between feral animals in which, until killed and subdued, there is no property, and domestic animals in which the right of property is perfect and complete. Justice Brown also posited that because of their rabies predisposition, dogs are unreliable and must be restrained. Same with Plessy versus Ferguson. Justice Brown's decision to withhold the constitutionality of racial segregation in public facilities under the separate but equal doctrine also guaranteed that no blacks be free to roam. Justice Brown seems to fear the free movements of what should be restrained. If you look at these two cases side by side, only 1 year apart, it is easy to see the interconnectedness of the animal and the black question, not only at the historical, but also at the legal level. What is interesting today is that what often attracts attention is not the white man, but the black man as the owner of an attacked dog. Think again of Michael Vick and his animalization through his fighting dogs. Jean-Claude Baker, in his biography of Josephine Baker, finds a correlation between black freedom of movement and the ownership of fierce dogs. Talking about his adoptive mother, Josephine Baker, in the Paris of the mid-20s, the author says that he was always surprised to see that there were so many blacks, African Americans, walking with ferocious dogs around. And he felt like maybe, thinking about it, it's because in Europe, they could take a kind of revenge. They could own the same kind of dogs that chased their ancestors. So they were in little hotel rooms and they had those huge dogs, just as a form of historical revenge. Well, there is no doubt that black emancipation could have resulted in a risk of any type of black ownership, included dog ownership. And I do believe that could have been easy to see blacks with big dogs as a form of revenge and very dreadful. But I think that this association is rather based on the white fantasy of black revenge. Blacks do not own fierce dogs as retribution for slavery, but those who do own dogs are unconsciously perceived as revengeful due to the lingering fantasy of the Cujo effect. Blacks owning big dogs enacts Justice Brown's double fear, the black and the dog together on the loose without the white master. There is an abundance of examples, past and present, of conjoined racialization and animalization in our history, society, and laws. The goal is not to ignore them, but only to make sure that they are used properly. Since the book came out, I have seen many instances where we are confronted with a dreaded analogy in our everyday life. Think of PETA, the PETA Super Bowl ad. Or more interesting and a little bit of unpacking, and I will end with that example, is the Central Park bird watching incident in May 2020. So I don't know if you've heard about this incident, but the two main protagonists carry the same last name. It's a coincidence. They're both called Cooper. But it looks as if they represent two sides of the same human character. I see this story as the perfect pastoral fable about humans and nature. The story takes place in the forest, but somehow in the world within the world, since it's in the middle of Manhattan, like kind of in a Shakespeare play, like As You Like It, when there is a play within a play. At the heart of the story is the animal, the dog. Christian Cooper is an avid bird watcher and was spending that morning of May observing birds in Central Park. He was standing in a portion of the park that requires dogs to be on a leash. He asked a white woman, Amy Cooper, who was walking by, to put her dog on a leash. She apparently refused. This is when Christian Cooper started filming the exchange. In response, Amy threatened to call the police to tell them that an African-American man was threatening her life. And she did call. Amy was fully aware of the historical power of this threat on the black man in America. The video went viral. Amy was deemed a Karen of the worst kind, as you can imagine, and America once again had to reckon with the legacy of Jim Crow. In a news clip later, Christian Cooper was invited to relive the incident and give details to the viewers about the incident. But in the video, as an avid bird watcher in Central Park, Christian is so taken by the enchanted world surrounding him that he cannot even focus on the incident that brought us all here. The birds chirping is far more important. Next to the birds, being a black man seems incidental to him, though it was not for Amy at the time. Christian Cooper has been recalled as a black man by Amy Cooper, and he has been reminded that he's a threat to society for being black and is in need to be restrained. I could say so much more about this video, particularly the image of Christian Cooper comparing his familiarity with the sound of the birds to the voice of a mother, which reminds me of George Floyd crying for his mother while taking his last breath. But the eerie situation, I should tell you, is that those two incidents, the death of George Floyd and the bird watching incident, happened on the same day, on May 25th, 2020. So animality is never far behind, and animality is never far from blackness. The way Amy Cooper treats the black man is the same way, as you can see, she's treating her dog in this video, a dog who can hardly breathe. Amy Cooper shows a total disregard for what is not white or human. And she understands the world to feel exactly as she does, as she uses the word African-American as a code word for the police to come to her rescue, exactly like the code word from the 1990s used by the police in LA, which was NHI, non-human involved, to talk about blacks. Since the incident, Cooper has been writing, he wrote a graphic novel about what it is to be bird watching while black. And this is a story that you can imagine with someone who gets some lenses, and through the lenses, he looks at history. So you have the bird side by side with George Floyd and some Amadou Diallo, Breonna Taylor. Oh, sorry. So since the incident, so you saw that, I would like to conclude just by saying that after writing Afro-Dog, seeing the interconnectedness of the racial and animal question in our history and culture has become almost second nature to me. The problem is that once you start scratching the surface, there is so much more deep down, and it can be overwhelming. And once you see, you cannot unsee it. And I hope that this presentation has not been too overwhelming for you too. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Benedicte. So we're going to have a lot of time for questions. I thought I might start with a question or two, but you can intersperse your own as we go. I was going to start with sort of where you began, which was with the problem of speaking for the animal. And for those of you who have read Afro-Dog, you know that there's a coda at the end of the book that's really quite moving, and it talks about the feeling of illegitimacy of writing about the animal. And earlier in the book, there are several passages where you say things about the fear of muting the individual and sort of treating them as generalized characteristics of a species. And I wonder, in a room with many lawyers and persons who do legal work, what your thoughts are and what your reflections are for people who are representing an animal. And so they write something to speak for the animal. They are trying to speak for the animal in court or to a lawmaker. And if you have thoughts about that, and are there types of speaking for the animal that you approve of? The animal says, I don't want to be hurt, versus the animal wants retribution, or the animal cares a lot about deterring crime or something like that. Do you have thoughts for a lawyer audience who may be filing cases on behalf of animals?
I think it was important, thank you for the question, it was important for me to start with this because I had to grapple with that the whole time. And as I said in the coda, for two reasons. First, because as I said, I'm not an animal, and it's really a strange feeling to speak on behalf of the animal. And also because there is a way of essentializing not just animals, but most minorities who don't get to speak for themselves. And I remember going to a conference not a long time ago about Octavia Butler's African-American author, and there was a Black woman talking about us Black women. And I remember another Black woman standing up in the room and saying, I don't feel this us Black women. I don't feel the same way that you feel. So it's very complicated to start talking group as well, particularly those who don't get to speak for themselves and sometimes are overly represented as well. But we don't have a choice. So I totally understand that when it comes to law, you speak on behalf as lawyers, you have to speak on behalf and advocate for the victim. It's just the way of doing it as well, and being very mindful of not over speaking for the victim and not maybe ascribing your own purposes and your own goals and your own emotions when it comes to speaking and advocating for someone. And as you took the example of what you can get and what you cannot get when you talked about prosecution, and you've really mentioned before, the Desmond's Law looked into it, is the idea of advocating, and particularly using students, is a marvelous and beautiful idea, advocating for the animal who cannot speak for themselves in a court of law and having someone for them. But what is the purpose? It depends on the goal. Is the goal to give information so that we are very aware of the case and speak for the animal in terms of victimhood, or is to try to get, as this is why I really, really enjoyed your book, is try to get an aggressive sentence and a prosecution to make sure to be tough on crime. When do you speak on behalf of the victim, or when do you speak on behalf of your own ideology of the criminalization of an institution?
Yeah, that's really helpful, thanks. If anybody wants to jump in with a question, I mean, there's a lot, or I'm happy to keep going. I have many, but yeah, please in the back. I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. I didn't know that rule, but we're gonna have you come down and speak at the microphone, I guess, so it's recorded. I'm sorry, that makes it a little more. No, you're good. A little less conversational.
Thank you for that beautiful presentation. Actually, I've been thinking lately about the role of art. And and sort of changing our consciousness, and how and your presentation really, I guess, was an example of how, because it's gentle and it's soft, and it's a good way to, it really, it's like art. It was artistic, and it was a good way to sort of, I could see how you could use that to talk to even like to convert, I suppose, people who haven't given thought to this concept. So I really appreciate that. I guess my question is that I struggle with is, as a African American person who wants to, there's a lot of DEI stuff going on. For example, at my organization, I work for Thomson Reuters, and it's great, and I love it. But I always, I want to bring up this notion of intersectionality and just how we need to sort of think about the commonalities. But I never want to, the last thing you want to do is offend somebody and say, what, you're comparing me to an animal? And it's very difficult to do that if I am not a Black person, I think, for me at least. And I'm just wondering, what tips do you have? I mean, you talk about doing it the right way. If you only have 10 minutes, you don't have the luxury of a presentation, and you're talking to people who are new to this, have never really given it any thought. So this is a new concept. What do you do to introduce that thinking to them in a gentle way that's not going to offend?
It's a sensitive question when it's quick, right? But again, it's really emphasizing the interconnectedness, and not to try to get a quick win for the animal cause, but really understand that we should think about the animal cause within the context of the civil rights movement, of gender, and bringing maybe different types and multiplied types of oppression. So it's not emphasizing that old analogy, but it's more in the broader and more expansive context of a much bigger interconnectedness in the world, I guess.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's really nice. Yeah, I mean, on that point, it's striking because you make such a point in the book that the comparisons are inevitable, that they're inextricable. And I think that for many in the room who have been, confronted with campaigns, certainly in the United States, the analogies between, as you point out in your presentation, the dreaded comparison, the analogies between slavery and racial oppression and animal oppression are so ubiquitous. I wonder what you think about doing what you say not to do, like instrumentalizing animals or instrumentalizing race, if you thought that it was going to do something good, right? So you care about animals. If you thought that a PETA lawsuit alleging that orcas were being held in conditions that were like slaves was going to free an orca, what would be your advice to those advocates or to the Non-Human Rights Project when they're saying, well, we think that our only way, of course, there's no way of actually knowing, right? There's no way of knowing that the argument is actually going to have more rhetorical force and that it's going to persuade a judge or a lawmaker. But if you were convinced that the instrumental use either of animals to advance racial exploitation or the instrumental use of race to advance animals could work, would you still say, no, we cannot do it? Or where would you come down on that?
It's a very difficult question to think about. Again, a quick win versus a more ethical and longer approach to things as well, because you set precedents and you reenact what you're trying to, within the context of animal cruelty or animal oppression, what you're trying to, for society to get to step away from. So by reenacting it yourself, I don't think it's beneficial in the long run. So it's the question of quick win or a longer approach to how you practice law, I think.
That's helpful.
It's a difficult question.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have. It's very I think it's very different to be a scholar and don't have this kind of stakes
Burden.
than to be a lawyer.
That's good. Does anybody else want to? Yeah, please. Oh, yeah, sorry, thank you. Yeah. If people want to come down to the microphone, I'll just call on you all so you don't have to march across.
Hi. I just had a question about, so I recognize that there's a lot of social issues and animal rights issues that could be solved in tandem, as you mentioned. But about, my question is more about what happens when they conflict. So, for instance, Muslims are like a marginalized population in North America, and their practices, I think, are very scrutinized by dominant culture. And like Eid al-Adha is a requirement for Muslims, and it's like an encouraged practice. What happens when that's a conflict with animal rights, and how do you think that should be addressed? Because typically, whenever you look at places like legislatures, parliament, there's a certain type of composition, and there's a certain type of individual who usually represents these people. So when you have a practice like that, I feel like that being outlawed by parliament is almost perceived as patronizing, and it's not necessarily seen as coming from a good place. In particular, because like dominant culture has espoused these practices for very long, and now there's a huge backlash when there's a certain community doing it.
Quite a difficult question to approach, and I think that's the sticky part of the law as well. when the two intersect and are in conflict. I think it's a little bit, what would be the practical way of doing it? Practicality, I do not know. Ethically, yes, you have to be, again, this is why it's just important to be mindful of that. I would maybe use the example of punching up and punching down. That is very different when you have to deal with minorities that are already part of an oppressed group, then we have to deal with just humanity as a whole. And that this have to be taken into consideration when the two intersect, and that you cannot maybe have a blanket or approach, at least lens, to the issue when it comes to punching up and punching down. And it's always reminds me also of whether it's halal practice, but also kosher practice as well, of how it all started in 1933 when it came to Nazi Germany, and Hitler, who was an avid animal activist and who demonized Jews for the kosher tradition of slaughter as well, and how the two easily intersected, and how he started actually his attack on Jews through his way of representing the kosher tradition of slaughter as well. So I think we have to be very mindful of the historical implication in the past of dealing with those types of intersection, animal exploitation and animal cruelty, and traditions from a minority group within a particularly Western context. And it's too sticky for me to have the practicality or the practical answer to that, besides saying that's something that should be handled with care and be mindful of both.
And if I may, do you think that there is a potential for, within the community, I find there's a lot of dissent. So even within Islam, you'll find people who intend to be vegetarian, although it's not customary. Do you think that if they're given a little bit more of a platform and opportunities for education, so I notice especially whenever I go into my community,
yes,
things like literacy isn't necessarily as important as something like philosophy, the arts. Those aren't nearly as important as like mathematics or
yes,
medicine. But if there's potential for that for Muslim students, do you think that that could probably course correct, and that way there'd be a larger dissent within the community? And if given opportunities for these individuals to be in positions of power, maybe they'd be able to correct within the community themselves, and that way it doesn't have to become patronizing?
Yes, and that's the point of allyship as well. And I think in order to have that trust, you need to see a trend of trust and allyship, and to be able to open the door to that community and go from the inside, for sure.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for that fascinating presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm working more in the gender and animality kind of comparison, and we have our own dreaded comparison. So instead of being slavery, it's rape. And I found it quite interesting what you said about the sequential logic of the analogy. First, we abolished slavery, then now we need to abolish animal exploitation. I don't really see that with the rape analogy, even though it's also very controversial. You don't hear like, first we ended the rapes of women, now we need to end the rapes of cow, because people, I haven't really heard this discourse. So I was wondering, first of all, do you think it exists? Like, do you think there's also this sequential logic with the gender? And if or when it isn't present, do you think it might explain, because you just answered a previous question, like maybe adding gender and other oppressions can kind of attenuate that problem of always comparing the Black person to the animal. So do you think the analysis that you gave, do you think there's like it's a hugely different context with gender, or do you think it raises the same kind of issues with this like sequential logic?
Sequential logic may be less so, in the sense that when it comes to gender representation, it also intersects with the dominant population more than a minority group. So I think we are more aware that it's an ongoing battle. But there is ecofeminism is still one side part of the animal rights question. So there is always a sort of marginalization as well. But I wouldn't compare both in that sense, but they have to come together, because I think, yes, there's still a marginal way of looking at animal rights and exploitation and oppression.
Yeah, go ahead and come down. In the meantime, I was wondering if you would say a little bit, because I think the theme of allyship is such a powerful one, and one that probably many people relate to who are trying to overcome maybe counterproductive analogies. In the book, and then again today I wasn't quite as sure, but in the book I saw that you seemed, to my eye, to accept the evolution of the term intersectionality beyond what Professor Crenshaw had envisioned, in a way that you maybe thought it was not offensive, that it was a point of interconnection and that was okay. But today I thought maybe you were suggesting that the term had lost some of its meaning, and maybe that was negative. And I think some of the advocates, I hear that conversation from time to time, like, you're misusing the term, intersectional because this is what Crenshaw meant. Do you think that that's a danger? Or do you think this sort of emphasizing points of interconnection as an intersectional idea is okay for lawyers, non-scholars?
I think it's okay because the word evolves, and I just meant to draw attention to the origin of the term. It has to be, when being used, it has to be known that what it was meant to be, but I also think it's a little bit like Black Twitter. I'm not on Black Twitter, but I have some of my colleagues who are on Black Twitter, and they tell me, if you look at mainstream semantics today, it often comes from Black Twitter. So as soon as the word becomes trendy within the Black community, it quickly moves to mainstream, which means that the African American community comes up with a different word. So it's not like they hold on to it with their copyright. So I think when it comes to semantics, you cannot step back. You just have to come up with the next one. And it's a community that is used to it, semantically speaking. So when it comes to it, which is also what always interested me, because it's so it's not my native language, it's not my native culture. So I'm looking at how fast the African American community comes up with different words. And I was always surprised. I got to talk to one of AFCO about one of the two sisters about the Black Freegan movement. And when she gave a talk, I remember I was there and I said, you often explain that Black veganism is not exactly what veganism is. She said, no, that's not what I mean. And I remember asking her, if it takes so long to explain what Black veganism is, why not come up with a word? Because this is something I'm so used to, and it is so efficient to try to change things and come up with a new word. And maybe that's what will happen soon. But I think semantics have to evolve, and in an organic way, it's just a way to come up with different words.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Please.
That was good.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for your talk, and thank you for Afro-Dog, which I think was such a beautiful and necessary intervention. I'm also a literary studies scholar, so I'm sort of naked before all the legal people, but as Derrida says, perhaps thinking begins there. To go back to the sort of, because one of the frustrations in sort of some Black critical theory, I'm not trying to get too much into the weeds here, is, what that will tell you is that there's often an idea of like a unitary humanity that's sort of positioned against the animal, and this is something that everyone has achieved, right? And thus something that we all want to overcome. And I was thinking about this question alongside what you brought up earlier with sort of the question of recognition, and how do we think about and sort of honor the potential of like non-human kind of self-recognition and a Fanonian term, or like almost a glissant kind of right to opacity. I'm curious how you sort of think about that question.
Can you repeat a little bit? So this glissant approach to opacity would be for the non-human, how to deal with this and how to maybe be okay with this, you mean?
Yeah, like what
Yes.
would it mean to do a kind of justice or a kind of honoring of like a non-human right to opacity?
Yes, and I think it's a good question. I think to go back again within the context of the law, I think the law is made by man for man, and same with logos and discourse. So there is always a sense that there will be a failing there, and how to be comfortable with the voicelessness and the opacity is something that is not human. I think this is how humans feel that they can master the situation, is through the logos and through words. But you're very right that feeling comfortable with opacity, that might be more a problem of translation or untranslatability, not being able to translate everything when it comes to different groups of humans or non-humans. And you're very right. But is it an idealistic idea? Yes, for people who are not in the legal system. In the legal system, it's based on the logos, and that's
Yeah.
a different track.
Yeah, because I'd be curious sort of about, and this might be a larger conversation about how like a politics of recognition would work and how to think about like sort of resisting, this kind of essentialism
Yes.
while still doing kind of like justice projects,
Yes.
basically. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Please, others. Yeah, please, Anish, go ahead.
Thank you for this very sensitive treatment of these contentious issues. So what I got from your talk was that it's really apparent where the damage is when we're comparing subjects in this way, the subjects of oppression and subjugation. But it seems to be that we are like addicted to returning to this comparison
Yes.
over and over again, right? And in some ways, it's like also there's something there that we sense is similar. So you know, as advocates, you want to use that comparison, right? And what it seems to me to be the difference is that there's a difference between comparing the actions of the oppressors and the subjugators. And then this like slippery slope into then comparing the subjects of that oppression, right? And saying that that's why, versus, if for scholars or thinkers that are looking at these systems of oppression, it's really, in fact, enlightening to look at how they're similar, right? How they're built from the same root and source and assumptions. But also what I get from the talk is that it's so treacherous and that the history of sliding back and forth between comparing oppressors' behavior and the subjects of that oppression is so, like, it gets so blurred and it's been so damagingly done that I feel like people who are sensitized by talks like yours and work like yours to these problems, it just becomes like a no-go zone. It's like unless we scholars or thinkers come up with like some clear way to talk about these issues for people who are sensitive to this, I feel like it really becomes like, I think there's a lot of self-censorship, like I can't go there, I might say the wrong thing or whatever. And I guess my question is kind of like, is that an okay thing, like for now? Because, until we actually figure out a way not to do this damage, not to keep repeating this damage, maybe I don't know if that's a good thing to say or a good outcome, but like, is what do you think of that? Like, is it just, should everybody just like maybe quiet down and like, not just without thinking, start to go into the suitcase of past arguments or whatever and just sort of pull out willy-nilly, like, Bentham and like, I guess the Francione work we were talking about. Is that a good result? I wonder.
I think you're so right in so many ways when it comes to the systemic problem and looking at it at a systemic level and as the individual level and the subjects. I think it's you really hit it on the nail. I think it's a huge difference between the two, and you're right there. There are two levels when it comes to that. When it comes to not going there, it's true as well, you're right, that there is so much pain. And if you look at the 1619 Project or the critical race theory, you see that this is how this America was, that's the backbone of America. Black slavery is the backbone of America. So it's a very sensitive topic. And even within the community itself, give an example of Frank Wilderson, who is a scholar from a movement called Afro-pessimism. And his idea is that the Black condition is without analog. You cannot compare the Black condition with any other oppressed groups in history, because the Black condition is the only one in America that was that didn't have personhood, that was treated as a property and as an object. So he says, how can you compare not being part of the human game, being outside of the human game, as to being inside the human game but being exploited or being oppressed? So that's always been his claim. And yet, even if he says it's without analog, he fast goes into comparing Blacks with cows, how they are being slaughtered and accumulated. So within the community itself, I think it's a raw topic, the idea of having being treated as chattel, as cattle. And it's a very sensitive, you see it, it's always right beneath the surface. When you think of Hurricane Katrina, the first thing that happened within the community was to say, look, they are rescuing pets and not us. So even though the comparison itself can be very demeaning, particularly when it's done by someone outside of the community, this comparison itself is within every one of the subject in that community. So you're right, it's a hot potato. And what do you do with that? Maybe you deal with it once we've worked through it together as a community, as a larger community, and not within the African-American community, and not people from the outside who just use it to advance a different cause. I think we need years to deal with it. You're very right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's very interesting. Please, Chris. Yeah, no, take your time. No rush.
Thanks. As always, MH asks such great questions. It led me to a follow-up question, which is just to put it in the question in very tangible terms. So I teach animal law, and for example, animal liberation, of course, everyone needs to be exposed to that. In the original preface, Peter Singer is very explicit about the relationship between enslaved peoples and animals. In later editions, that disappears from the preface. So if you get the 25th anniversary edition, the original preface is at the back, but the front preface really doesn't go into that topic. Similarly, the Non-Human Rights Project early on was much more vocal about trying to use the analogy of enslaved people seeking habeas corpus as an example of when a sentient living being, but yet considered property under the law, was able to access habeas corpus. And we got a lot of pushback from judges, including judges who just said, do not talk about that. And so in their current work, it's much more toned down. So in a way, there's almost an erasure, an attempt to erase a history within this movement where efforts were made and they perhaps, realized they were done in an insensitive way. Yeah. And so that's just one more layer on top of this that I think we have to come to terms with as well. Yes. And then you put all of that together in teaching a course, yes. which, as you know, limited time, lots of yes. things to cover. And in an environment where, students are rightly extremely aware and of every issue yes. and keep faculty just really honest yes. about the importance of speaking authentically and sensitively about all these things without stifling difficult conversations. Mm-hmm. So, I think it's really, we're really wrapped into a difficult position, and I'm not really asking you to solve it for us so much as just to say that the problem really is now multi-layered. Yes. When I see this trying to move away from things within the animal protection literature, and that itself is a story yes. that has to be talked about. So I want to make this a question for you, but I don't want to ask you to solve it for me as someone teaching animal law. But if that raises any thoughts for you, I'd love to hear about it, about these multiple stories that we now have going on.
It's such a huge question, and mm-hmm. I'm glad you bring it up because, as you said, teaching today about animal law and making those types of comparison is not like 25 years ago. I think we are teaching to a different generation with very mindful of those types of sensitive topic. And it's, I cannot answer that question now. It's something we have to work through, and there should be workshops and more discussions with the students themselves to apply that knowledge and ask them, how do we work through that without completely ignoring and, but at the same time being mindful of what it means.
Yeah, can I just
It's
ask,
a collective project.
yeah, just quick follow up. Right, it's not on us to just, you know, have them read the original Peter Singer introduction, but not comment on it.
Yes.
Not bring that for discussion, but then the discussion of what do you think about that comparison? This is more a question of classroom dynamics, where students are very afraid to say things like, it's a little offensive, but it might have been important to raise, you know, to raise the very troubled situation of animals. But so then it gets into all these questions we're all familiar with of classroom dynamics and how to manage what we call at Harvard difficult conversations, but they're really just, you know, inflammatory conversations sometimes, and then the student gets labeled as the one who didn't care about the comparison. So
I have the same experience with in my classes when it comes to race as well, because this whole idea of essentializing the Black experience and people saying we. Often I used to tell grad students, don't say we, because it's jarring, because you don't have the same experience as others. It's just one Black experience. And I put them into groups where we read an op-ed about a student complaining about this new climate in the classroom where you cannot really speak up and say how you feel. And they all agreed from all different groups that they cannot speak in front of a whole classroom because they're afraid to end up even being canceled.
Yes, so we talk about cancel culture all the time as well, and they're afraid to say that one thing, and then they're labeled.
Yes, because they live on social media. I'm not even aware of that, but they can be canceled within their own social media, not even in the classroom. And it's not easy.
Thank you for helping us think.
Yeah, and I know that Camille is really into timeliness as Angela. So we'll end with maybe just one more question. I would throw out, I mean, I think it's such an interesting point with your conversation with Kristen, because it gets back to my first question about sort of long-termism versus short-term gains, right? And was this, you know, as Kristen said, were some of these things done? Were they necessary at the time? Were they not necessary? It's hard to know, right? There's empirical questions. And even, I think some of the work that you cite from Sister Vegan, there are a couple people who looked at the PETA lawsuit about slavery and said, well, this awoke in me, right? This did something to me. Exactly what you said. It said, like, you know, as a person of color reading this slavery lawsuit it spoke to me in a way. So it's quite hard to know some of these boundaries. But yeah, please go ahead.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask whether there's an opportunity for like some sort of a working session with this group here somehow. I would love to brainstorm how to, because I love what we're doing here. And my concern, going back to the woman's question, is do we leave it alone for now until we figure this out? I really want to, as I mentioned, at Thomson Reuters, and that's just one example, DEI is huge and allyship is huge. And I'm really racking my brain on how do I don't want to say ride that wave, because that sounds negative, but I mean, I love all the we call them business resource groups. I think they're phenomenal. There's 9 or 10, but I always feel like, how do I introduce the concept of animals into this so that either we get a business resource group for people who identify themselves as animal lovers without offending anybody. And I'm just wondering if, you know, this is a great group of people here who are both sensitive, professional, and, you know, can maybe help me brainstorm that. And I'm sure others could benefit from it too. So if there's an opportunity at any point to put together a workshop or anything like that, whether it's during this 3-day conference or at a later point, that would be very helpful.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I hope you'll join me in thanking our guest, Benedicte Boisseron. Thank you. It was really wonderful. Thank you. It was I think it was